of everyday life. The uses of buses, taxis, trains, trams, a cable car, yes, really, boats and aeroplanes, but not helicopters, yet. Help us get from A to B with our fellow commuters, travellers and holiday makers. Transport modes like trains and buses were initially the main form of public transport for many decades, from the mid-19th century to the mid-20th century, and also freight transportation from the mid-18th century to the mid-20th century. However, during the mid-20th century, the car became more available to more people, and cheaper too, which led to more roads being built, and new towns and cities were also built, as well as the expansion of existing towns and cities with new housing estates and suburbs. Lorries, vans and trucks also took on the freight transportation. Due to the increase of private transport ownership, public transport usage declined, except on planes, as many people wanted to go abroad for their holidays. But in the late 20th century, there were too many cars on the road causing too much pollution. Public transport returned to popularity unnecessarily to ease traffic off the roads. More people used buses and taxis, and soon passengers on the railways rose. Trams, which for the second half of the 20th century seemed to be a niche and nostalgic yet funny thing of the past, became more appealing by the end of the century. And new tram systems across the country were built in time for the start of the 21st century. There's even a few boat services here and there, and did I mention there was a cable car? With an increased use of public transportation in the early 21st century, overcrowding and pollution on the roads has decreased. Hopefully. And there have been demands for further public transportation, such as new railways, hybrid buses, although they use their diesel engines most of the time, electric cars, which could be used as taxis, and new tram systems. However, in 2020, when the coronavirus or COVID-19 pandemic came along, public transport was hit hard as new restrictions came into play and people were encouraged not to travel unless absolutely necessary. Restrictions eased over the year, but public transport took a big hit thanks to its lowered use over the year. Travellers have been advised to travel at off-peak times in the day, take less busy routes, and reduce changes, buy a ticket in advance and use contact payment, keeping a minimum of 1 to 2 distance away from people and to wash their hands for at least 20 seconds after completing their journeys. Face coverings are mandatory or compulsory on public transport, and those without a face mask could be turned away or fined. The railways are a particular example due to their necessary use by people, reduced number of passengers over the year and notable safety measures being taken. As well as on trains, passengers have to wear face coverings whilst at stations. Extensive cleaning will be taking place on trains and at stations when there are no or few passengers, and there are hand sanitation units at stations. Some companies such as Avanti West Coast have run extra trains to help with social distancing. Between March 2020 and July-August 2020, there were a reduced amount of trains due to the earlier restrictions and reduced passengers requiring to travel by train. Greater Anglia, during the first lockdown, only ran 2 trains an hour per direction between London-Liverpool Street and Cambridge North, and 2 trains an hour per direction between London-Liverpool Street and Stansted Airport on the West Anglia main line, later reintroducing an hourly per direction service from Bishop Stortford to Stratford on the same line. Another example of the lockdown has been the 95% decrease of journeys on the London Underground. Meanwhile, with buses across the country during the lockdown, there was a demand response transport, which was a bus service that acts similar to a taxi, whilst regular bus services were suspended or reduced. This was not the case everywhere, as some bus services remained in use in some places. However, the services were restricted or reduced. Although freight transportation by road has been an essential job following the lockdown, rail freight transportation has also been reduced. However, rail and bus passenger numbers rose when restrictions about travel were eased to allow more people to travel, resulting in the reintroduction of regular services on most rail and bus routes. Meanwhile, planes have fared better, as, according to Professor Kwon Chen at Purdue University in Indiana, USA, that air on planes is replaced every 2 to 3 minutes as opposed to every 10 to 12 minutes in an office building. Most planes have a high-efficiency particulate air filter, which captures smaller air particles than usual air conditioning systems, and even some viruses. Though distancing on planes is more difficult than on trains and buses. Face covering is also mandatory at airports as well as at ferry ports when travelling by ferry, and bus and coach stations when travelling by bus or coach. The future is uncertain, as it always is. But one thing that is for certain is that public transport will continue to play a key role in many people's lives, from work and business to pleasure and fun. As mentioned earlier, there are new public transport systems being put into place and further operations are being extended. Passenger numbers are expected to rise and less people are expected to use their cars. Many people are travelling further than before by both public and private transport. Further public transportation will be needed to match these growing numbers in the future. Don't forget to click below to subscribe to the Nicholas Payne YouTube channel.